Laetitia, this next question I think is rather specific, and I'd love to get your thoughts in on it. On the 15th of September, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stressed the urgent need for a temporary prohibition on the sale and use of AI systems that pose a serious risk to human rights until adequate safeguards are put in place. I guess my question, obviously I think we've heard about some of these issues earlier in the conversation, is, you know, in the absence of enforcement mechanisms in most countries, how do you propose discussions on clear red lines for AI use cases to move forward?
Wow. Okay, that's quite the question.
Hard question. Yeah.
So on the 15th of September, okay, so I think because there we're talking, about prohibition of some AI systems, and I think that that's obviously for some things it's very interesting because when you talk, because obviously historically, for example, if you look at atomic bombs, that's seen as quite like a physics, a STEM subject. And I think even experts within the high-level expert group on AI at the that was set up by the European Commission, I think that was one of the first things that they said, you know, is kind of do not repeat history, do not try and use AI as weapons and like try and use physics for those kind of things. But with regards to fundamental human right values, I think this is also very interesting because the European Union, so if we look at trade, I specialize in trade, basically, in the World Trade Organization. And what you see is that the EU uses its power, its regulatory power for trade to be like, yeah, I'll do trade with you if you follow my fundamental rights. If you think that and if you breach this charter, then we'll have to reconsider our trade deal. And it's doing more and more of that. It's moving towards that. And I think that with AI, that's definitely something that, you know, I mean, the EU is really leading the way with its general data protection regulation. Now it's trying to have an AI regulation, and even then, you know, it's trying to ban these. The prohibition of. I can't remember the word, but anyway, so it prohibits some uses of AI. But what's interesting, so from my perspective, so obviously I did law quite heavily. And now I do sociology of law. And actually what I say is, okay, maybe there's laws, but there's also norms that regulate, there's informal norms that regulate. And what are those? And those are so interesting, especially to me, because there you kind of see when there isn't law, what actually happens, because innovation still has to happen, no matter what the lawyers are saying. And also the lawyers might not be up to date on what is going on. So for me, I looked at, for example, the setting of depression and social robotics. And, you know, a social robot, the definition of social robot is that it looks at you and it tries to interact with you with social cues. So it will gaze at whoever is talking, it will wave to someone who's just entered, you know, and it's pretty clever from that perspective. So to lawyers, it would be very clever. But actually, the truth is it has to have a lot of exploration and it needs a lot of constant iteration to understand how to better it. So it's not that clever. And I think that this idea that Tarunima said, you know, we should not look at robots as humans, but we should look at them maybe as like, maybe, I don't want to be rude to animals, but maybe having more of like this animal approach of like, okay, like, you know, we need to bring it with us and we need to be a bit more wary. And that's exactly what developers are doing. They're aware of this, and that's a norm within themselves. And they always, so then because that's a norm and how they innovate, they're like, oh, okay, like we constantly need to iterate, but they iterate on their initial idea in the first place, and that might not be completely right. So I think that that's also something that policymakers, regulators really need to grasp and quickly to actually help developers in these exploration phases to get it right. If that's even possible.
Prateek, can I get a 60-second response before we move on?
For sure. So I'll quickly chime in on some of the issues that, for instance, Vrinda raised around judicial operators and capacity building, and the broader question you posed to Laetitia on how do you enforce things. So the legal aspects, regulation is, of course, one aspect of driving enforcement forward. The other one is, of course, training, capacity building. So what we've been working at UNESCO is developing a training module for judicial operators globally. UNESCO has trained over 23,000 judges, lawyers over the past 10 years in freedom of expression, access to information, safety of journalists, related legal aspects. And now we're working on AI and the rule of law. So we're not only looking at AI within how judicial systems are using it for strengthening administration, but also ensuring there can be checks on biases and some of the examples that were cited before, but also the legal implications of AI more broadly. Because once you have these laws, you also need the rule of law to be upheld. So you need to strengthen capacities of people who are going to be working on that. So that's something that we're working on, but also more broadly with young people on AI and human rights. Raising awareness through content which is more engaging, breaks down some of these concepts in a manner that is fun. So we've launched with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research micro learning on in 7 languages for young people on AI and defending human rights. So some of the activities related to literacy, but if I can just also put in, a lot of work happens at UNESCO on education and teacher training and competencies for teachers as well in this technology field. So that's some of the wider work here as well.
Thank you for that context. I think what we might sort of pivot to now is approaches to AI regulation, and I think we've touched on it quite comprehensively. But I'd love to maybe bring it back down into India, into the central point for India. So this next question, Vrinda, is going to be for you. Obviously, earlier this year, in April, the European Commission released its proposal for AI regulation. As I'm sure aware, it adopted a risk-based approach and divided the use cases into 3 tiers, basically: unacceptable risk, high risk, and low risk. I'd just love to get your quick, concise response on what would be an optimal level of rules-based regulation for AI within India. Obviously, looking at the cultural and the specific conditions of the technological environment within India.
Thanks. And I think this is one of those questions, so not everybody has sort of the same answer. So I kind of am off the camp where I do believe that before we talk about a risk-based approach, we need to be very clear about what we mean by AI and what all we are regulating within that scope of any such regulation. And I think so kind of before talking about any risk-based approach, it should be like, how are we looking at AI, and also what are we focusing on? So are we looking at the impacts of the technology? The focus really should be on the impact of technology, potential discrimination, rather than say just the technical models. And I think like having a definition that's going to focus on those points is also really important. So I think just before even India talks about any risk-based approach, that's sort of really important. And again, going back to the point that I had made about how you look at accuracy, but also bias, because I think especially in India, bias and discrimination are like very important and have to play a part in the conversation. I think, finally, one of the things that's really important also in the Indian context is having a proper purpose limitation. So, AI that's used for one purpose, the data that's collected for one purpose, how does it get shared across law enforcement agencies, especially because we don't have a data protection bill and we also don't have clearly defined SOPs, right? So, for instance, all the data that's being collected by CCTV cameras in Delhi, which is the capital, it's all just regulated by an SOP. That SOP is not always publicly accessible. We don't know, how much of that information is then being shared between agencies. When can the police access that data? What is the storage capacity? So I actually think that we have simpler problems sort of to deal with, which is having these basic purpose limitation, collection limitation, storage issues. And just to give you an example, so there was a Delhi High Court decision where the Delhi High Court had said, we have a problem of missing children, and so we allow the Delhi police to use AI to actually identify these missing children. Now, remember, this again comes in the absence of any legislative framework, but the High Court sort of gives its go ahead. And the police over time end up expanding that use from merely missing children to really just all kinds of tackling crime. And that leap is very easy to make when you don't have clearly defined regulations. And also when you don't have a culture where you're expecting such regulations. So I think in India, sort of, yes, I mean, maybe at some point a rule-based approach would be good, but I think at this stage, we really have to focus on having those basic like collection limitation, also like explainability and accountability, like algorithmic impact assessments, like these things are, I think, are right now more important in the Indian context.
Thank you very much. And that's the final question that I'd love to sort of get a sense of. Vasudha, this one will be for you. Obviously, I think in an environment where there is a lack of regulation, I think companies and businesses are generally pretty good about trying to self-regulate and self-moderate some of their own practices. So I'd love to get a sense, or like your opinions on how companies can integrate key self-regulatory building blocks within the AI system, specifically for data quality and fairness analysis.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for that question. So I think the first thing is companies have got to want to do it. Now that's a very tricky way to put it, but it's the truth. And I can talk about what us at Wadhwani have been trying to do to self-regulate the AI work that we do. So the first thing is that while we have a broad framework to guide us, we look at every project or every use case, particularly for AI, at its own merit. And we use those principles to guide us, but every project or use case is sort of evaluated separately to check whether it's being fair or whether it has any ethical issues or not. For example, lately we've been trying to establish how AI can help new areas such as livestock or even skilling and livelihoods. And while there was a lot of way in which AI could help, say, artificial insemination or improving the outcomes of breeding or milk production in livestock, that particular aspect was considered very ethically problematic, and it was deprioritized within our segment. And this was even before we got to the model development stage, right? Even before we even talked about what kind of data exists. Similarly, within skilling and livelihoods, for example, there was a lot of data that could be used to potentially predict a candidate's outcome success. So how successful would a candidate be in his entire career if he's enrolled in a particular education program? And this was, again, sort of something that we could delve into. But again, it's something that's very problematic to predict using AI. So that is something that we keep into consideration. Another interesting thing that we did was, for example, we have a project on TB where we're trying to predict the adherence or the loss to follow-up for every patient. And now that we have data, we're trying to divide that into cohorts to see if our model is performing well on each of the cohorts, or if any cohort is sort of being left out. But then another challenge that sort of came up was that we don't have data around, say, religion, gender. Gender we do, but religion or caste or other socioeconomic aspects that are very crucial in India, right? So there is some sort of, and that's obviously fair, but there's some sort of trade-off between data privacy and being able to ensure that we're building fair and unbiased AI. And I don't have the answer to that, but that's something to really think about.
Yeah, I think like we're delving into the abstract of a really new and emerging technology. So there's so many intersectionalities and so many moving pieces that it's never going to be a nuanced. It's never going to be a simple, straightforward answer. I think the complexity and nuance in this discourse is where that challenge lies. Obviously, we do have a couple of questions, so if we can limit it down to like a 60, 90-second response, that would be perfect. But I think first up we have Manongini Theagaraja. Can we please promote her to panelist? If I can just get you to unmute. Hello, welcome. The stage is yours.
Hello, everybody. My name is Manogni, and I'm a law student at Symbiosis Law School. And I wanted to ask about what would you consider the future of AI to be in legal technology? But also, I had this like curiosity about how is training and learning done when it comes to technology? Like, do you learn about gender when you're learning about technology, or is it like the last chapter in a textbook? Like, how do you learn? Because that's like a main thing. Like, why is it kept in the last? So yeah, I just wanted to know that. Yeah. Thank you.
I guess I can sort of jump in here so you're asking about when AI tools are used within the judicial system. Did I understand? Yeah, okay. So actually, so like I said, I did French law, and in France, I think there was a machine learning tool being used to basically understand what the judgment would be for asylum seekers seeking refugee status, and on the judge, basically, they found that they could sort of predict the outcome. And now this sort of technology is actually banned in France, so you can't, because it sort of questions the role of the judge. So it's not going great with that. And about gender questions, I can only talk from my own experience. I'm currently working with social roboticists, in case you hadn't guessed, because I've been talking a lot about them. And any questions of gender, they are not, they're a bit like Bambi on ice, like a deer on ice. They feel very uneven. So yeah, but it might not be true for everyone, but that's what I found personally.
That's okay. I'd like to also jump in on the last, I'll make it super short, on the last part of the
Please.
learning and the gender aspect. I think you touched on a very, very important point, Meninga, and I think this is also the criticism that usually when you learn computer science ethics, it's kind of like a course, that you take, I don't know, in the last year or something like that, but it's very disconnected from the rest of the curricula. And there are initiatives from the last couple of years that are trying to change that and embody really more ethical learning and policy-oriented kind of issues in the curriculum, and to make it part of each course, not just one single course. But those initiatives are very kind of like still in the beginning. I think they are quite developed in the US. But this year, for example, in October, I will start teaching such a course in France, and it will be the first time that such a course would ever exist in one of the biggest master programs for machine learning students. So this is where we are getting at. Super important. Thank you for the question.
If I could just quickly add to that, I think the question sort of is making the STEM folk almost seem like, oh, how do they? You went to school with a lot of them, right? Like you studied with a lot of them, and so I think what I'd also say is to flip that around. And I think what also needs to happen is that a lot of people who come from the social sciences need to also move, because in some ways I think that this is like a generalist skill at this point, right? And so what would be great, and I think it's quite doable, is like people who study law in their undergraduate go on to do a master's in data science, and they get into robotics. So I think the convergence can happen both ways. But I'll just quickly pause it. Yeah, pause at that.
Siddharth Moite would like to know how technology, and I guess in particular AI technology, is impacting electoral decisions, specifically within India, but I'm happy to expand that scope out. And if you have any examples, he'd love to hear about them. Yeah. Any takers for that question?
If I can go first quickly
Please.
on this. Yeah. So I work in a sector at UNESCO where we deal with these questions. I personally don't, but on election interference and stuff like that, and social media. So a lot of the kind of algorithms that you see on social media can be manipulated. We also see people just talking to each other, what I briefly referred to before as echo chambers, and just engaging with people of similar ideas, because that's what we by default like to learn and hear. So algorithms, to keep us hooked to the social media platform, give us what we really like. So that can put us as a society not be in conversation with each other, which can polarize societies quite a bit. But along with that, there is, of course, disinformation, which plays a big role in interfering in elections. You can have political parties doing that. And there is, to my knowledge, not a strong kind of a solution to this problem so far. We do have fact checking, we do have some other techniques, behavioral techniques, but it's not shown to be quite as successful. And similarly, what we saw in India, and I think in Brazil, where disinformation on WhatsApp is quite rampant, the limitation on a number of forwards that you can send. But people then still found ways around it as well. So these are some of the concrete ways in both one algorithmically on the platforms, and second by disinformation, which is deliberate. Thank you.
I would just add like maybe other aspects where like AI played some role maybe, or one is, so in Telangana you saw that in these local municipal elections the state election commission was asking people to be part of facial recognition technology systems to identify and authenticate their identity. And so you were seeing AI also, so apart from kind of the misinformation aspect, you also have this authentication of voters aspect. And so Telangana actually, and they relied on the constitutional provision, which allows them to conduct elections to justify the use of AI to authenticate the identity of voters. And another development that we're seeing is that the Election Commission of India is possibly thinking about linking Aadhaar, which is the biometric system, with voter IDs, again, to authenticate identity. So that's sort of the other aspect of the conversation that Prateek mentioned.
And I thought it'd be a really good opportunity. I know if I was an audience member sitting in those seats, the panel has been absolutely incredible. You're all highly experienced, highly accomplished. So I think this is a more of a personal question from me back, 10 years ago. What are some of the things you think are important for the future of AI technology? And as enthused as we all are, how can we, take the right steps, or what are the right areas to move into to really capitalize on the growth that's, being seen within AI? If I can just ask that we keep it real short, sharp, and sweet, that'd be much appreciated. But yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, that'd be great. Rohan, you've got your hand up, so jump in, please.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to mention one specific points around a lot of these AI technologies are developed by tech startups who are, especially the AI first tech startups who are well funded, a lot of investment. So I think there's some case to be made for even the investors, of these AI first companies to take some partial responsibility for the decisions of the companies in which they invest. They need to have their own frameworks. They need to kind of define their own metrics beyond just the metrics that the startups have, kind of asking the hard questions, looking at the guardrail metrics and so on, and not just like taking in blindly what the startups give them. Because often what happens is it's super easy for them to just hand wave and say that it's so hard to tell at the stage when we invent, and so they just shrug off the need to do that. But I think there has to be some responsibility, and they can also help startups kind of put together the right governance structures, also defining and measuring the ethical use of algorithms and so on. So that's a very, I think, one area which kind of gets missed because we put a lot of emphasis on the responsibility of policymakers and startups, but there's also investors who eventually shape the way a lot of, because they're the ones who control where the money flows. So I think there's some case to be made there.
For me, one of the major questions is because AI enables you to scale up massively. So for example, in healthcare, like I'm looking at perinatal depression, and it's like, according to whose standards are we using our template? Like what, like, so is it a bad doctor? Is it a good doctor? Who is it that's that we're using as our value base? I think those are huge questions that social scientists are really needed, as well as computer scientists on this. So yeah, I encourage everyone to look into it.
Yeah, I didn't get to talk about women's participation in AI. I'm a part of an NGO that works to promote women's participation in AI. I think that mentorship is equally important in getting women into these roles. So I really hope that everyone here can see what they can do to mentor other women around them to join this field.
Yeah, really important point. And Dr. Doaa, please.
10 seconds. No, I would just say, please, no matter if you're a lawyer, a philosopher, computer science, policy, just get out of the comfort zone of your zone and please interact with other people that from in different disciplines. It's super, super valuable. We can really learn a lot from each other's experiences.
That is, I think, the best note to end on. I think the panel has been absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much for taking the time yet again out of your days.